My name is Aaron Caldwell, and I manage a remote mountain observatory that most people don't know exists. It sits above the treeline on a granite ridge where the air thins and the road ends in a dead stretch of wind-polished stone. On clear nights, the sky feels close enough to touch. On nights like this one, it feels close enough to listen. I arrived just before sunset, the last orange light draining out of the valley as I locked the gate behind me. The observatory is older than it looks from a distance. The dome was built decades ago, patched and repainted, but the bones of the place are ancient in spirit. Steel that has absorbed cold for generations. Concrete that smells faintly of dust and ozone. Instruments that hum softly even when they're idle, as if remembering work they once did. I've always loved that first hour alone. The way the mountain settles when human noise leaves it. The wind slips around the structure and down into the ravines. Somewhere far below, rocks shift as the temperature drops. Feels honest up here. Stripped down. No light pollution, no radio chatter unless I turn it on. Just the stars waiting to be read. That's what I believed, at least when I first took the job. I used to think the observatory was about observation in the purest sense. Measure, record, compare. Keep emotion out of it. I spent years training myself to see patterns without assigning intention. Stars were nuclear furnaces. Galaxies were math made visible. Beautiful, yes, but indifferent. Tonight should have been routine. A scheduled solo shift to recalibrate the wide-field camera and run a full sweep of the southern arc. I powered up the control room, the monitors blooming softly in the dark, and shrugged off my jacket. The smell of cold metal and stale coffee lingered. Familiar, comforting. I checked the logbook first. Not the digital one, the physical ledger kept in a drawer beneath the main console. Leather-bound, pages thick and yellowed. Predates me by a long time. Every manager leaves notes in it. Weather anomalies, instrument quirks, maintenance reminders, things you don't want lost in a software update. I flipped to the latest page and scanned my own handwriting from the previous shift. Routine entries. Seeing conditions excellent. No cloud interference. Slight delay in dome rotation motor. Then, beneath that, a line I didn't remember writing. If the stars appear uneven, do not attempt to correct alignment manually. I stared at it longer than I should have. The words were neat, deliberate. My hand, unmistakably. I tried to recall the context. Uneven could mean a dozen things: sensor drift, atmospheric distortion. The note felt vague. Out of character. I told myself it was just fatigue from the last overnight run and closed the book. Outside, the sky finished darkening. The first stars came out sharp and steady, piercing points against a black so deep it felt textured. I rotated the dome and began opening the slit. The mechanism groaned briefly, then settled into its steady rhythm. Cold air spilled inside, carrying the clean, mineral smell of high altitude. As the telescope aligned, I leaned against the console and watched the live feed populate on the main monitor. Familiar constellations slid into view, exactly where they should be. That was when I noticed the silence. Not the absence of sound. There was still wind, the low electrical hum of equipment, but something subtler. The mountain felt paused, as if it were waiting for the night to finish something it had started. I shook off the thought and focused on my checklist. Calibration first. I ran the star field reference, comparing known positions to the incoming data. The software flagged a minor discrepancy. Less than a fraction of a degree. Normal enough. I initiated an automatic correction. The screen flickered. For a moment, the stars blurred, smeared across the display like chalk dragged sideways. Then the image snapped back into clarity. But the discrepancy warning was gone. Not resolved, gone. No record of it in the system log. I frowned and leaned closer. "That's not right," I said aloud, just to hear a human voice. I reran the check. This time, no errors. Perfect alignment. That should have reassured me. Instead, a slow pressure settled behind my eyes, like the beginning of a headache. I glanced at the physical logbook again, still half open on the desk. The line about uneven stars seemed darker now, the ink heavier against the page. Outside the dome slit, the sky looked unchanged. But when I raised my eyes from the monitor and stared directly upward, something felt off. Not wrong in an obvious way, just crowded, as if the darkness between the stars had thinned. I told myself it was altitude, lack of sleep, the mind reaching for meaning where there was none. I returned to the console and brought up a wider field view. The stars filled the screen edge to edge, crisp and cold. Then, slowly, almost shyly, one of them pulsed. Not a flare, not atmospheric distortion. A gentle dimming and brightening, like a breath taken and released. I checked the timestamp, the exposure settings. Everything was nominal. Another star pulsed. Then another, not in unison, but in a loose sequence that made my skin prickle. The pattern wasn't random, felt considered. I remembered something my predecessor, Martin, had said during my handover years ago. He'd been up here too long, skin permanently weathered, eyes always squinting as if bracing for light only he could see. We'd shared a coffee in this same control room while the sun came up. "Don't rush the sky," he'd said, almost casually. "It doesn't like being corrected." I'd laughed then, assuming it was just an old man's superstition. Now, alone under the dome, the words came back with uncomfortable clarity. The pulsing stopped. The stars returned to their steady glow, as if nothing had happened. The headache eased slightly, leaving behind a thin thread of unease that wrapped itself around my thoughts. I sat back and listened to the observatory breathe. Somewhere in the structure, metal contracted with a soft pop as the temperature continued to drop. My watch ticked loud in the silence. I reached for the logbook again, meaning to jot down an observation, anything to ground myself. When I turned the page, my stomach tightened. A new entry had appeared beneath the last one. Fresh ink, still faintly glossy. "If the stars correct themselves, do not thank them." I didn't write that entry. I knew it the same way you know when something behind you isn't just empty space anymore. The ink hadn't bled into the paper yet. Smelled faintly sharp, like solvent. My pen was capped on the desk where I'd left it. I stood there longer than I'm proud of, staring at the sentence as if it might rearrange itself into something sensible if I gave it time. The rational explanations lined up automatically. Muscle memory, sleep deprivation, a note written earlier and forgotten. None of them held. I closed the logbook and slid it back into the drawer harder than necessary. The monitors were steady. The sky feed showed nothing unusual. I forced myself back into routine, ticking through the checklist with deliberate care. Repetition has always been my way out of panic. You don't argue with fear, you outwork it. As I adjusted the spectrograph, a faint sound threaded through the control room. Not loud enough to place immediately. I muted the audio feed from the exterior microphones. The sound remained. It wasn't a voice. Not quite. More like a distant pressure change. The way your ears feel when an elevator stops between floors. It rose and fell in a slow rhythm that matched nothing mechanical in the room. I held my breath. The sound didn't stop. When I exhaled, it softened, like it had been waiting for that release. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the room. Everything was where it should be. The hum of the servers, the low vibration of the dome motors, the faint whistle of wind through seams that would never seal completely. Familiar layers of noise. The new sounds slid between them, unobtrusive and impossible to isolate. I pulled up the external pressure sensors. Stable. No sudden weather shifts. The mountain was calm. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer to the slit and looked up through it directly. The stars were brutally clear, each point etched against the dark. The Milky Way cut across the sky like a pale scar. I felt that familiar awe stir in my chest, the old joy that had pulled me into this work in the first place. Then I noticed the gaps. I don't mean empty space. Space is always empty. I mean the absence of what should have been there. Subtle at first. A star I expected to see missing. Another one slightly displaced, just enough that my mind tripped over the inconsistency. I cross-checked the live feed against the star chart. The software showed everything correct. Perfect. The stars on the screen did not match what I was seeing with my own eyes. The pressure behind my eyes returned, sharper this time. I squeezed them shut, then opened them again. The sky was unchanged. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay." I went back to the console and brought up the manual alignment controls. The discrepancy was small but real. I could correct it in seconds. My fingers hovered over the input. The memory of the logbook entry stopped me. If the stars appear uneven, do not attempt to correct alignment manually. I sat back slowly, heart beating hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. The sound in the room deepened, resonating faintly through the floor, through the chair beneath me. Not louder, closer. I switched on the radio and keyed the mic, just to break the isolation. "Base, this is Caldwell at the Observatory." "Radio check." Static answered me, then faintly a carrier tone. No voice. I released the button. The static continued for a second longer than it should have, then cut out abruptly, like something had decided the conversation was over. On the main monitor, one of the stars dimmed. Just one. Isolated. The rest of the sky held steady. The dimming wasn't smooth. It stepped down in increments like a controlled adjustment. I watched, frozen, as the star went dark. The space it had occupied didn't stay empty. The surrounding stars shifted subtly, redistributing themselves, closing the gap with delicate precision. The pattern reformed, seamless, as if the missing point had never existed. My stomach churned. I checked the time. Barely past midnight. I opened the drawer and took out the logbook again. My hands were shaking now, fine tremors that made the pages whisper against each other. I flipped back through older entries, skimming years of notes with growing urgency. At first, it was all mundane. Maintenance issues, weather logs, occasional complaints about isolation, written half-jokingly in the margins. Then, gradually, the tone shifted. Do not observe the same star for longer than necessary. If a star dims without atmospheric cause, avert focus for at least 60 seconds. Never align the telescope with the dark between constellations. I swallowed hard. The handwriting varied over the years, but the warnings were consistent. Specific. Procedural. This wasn't superstition. It was protocol. A low creak echoed through the dome as the structure adjusted to the cold. The sound carried oddly, stretched thin like it had too much space to travel through. I became aware of a new sensation then. Not sound, not sight. A feeling of attention, heavy and diffuse, pressing down from above. The way it feels when someone stands too close behind you, reading over your shoulder. I didn't look up. The air felt thicker, harder to draw into my lungs. Each breath tasted faintly metallic. I focused on the desk in front of me, on the solid human geometry of screens and switches. On the logbook page, another line was forming. The pen was still capped, still untouched. The ink bled into the paper slowly, the letters appearing one by one, deliberate and careful. Observation is permitted. Interpretation is not. My pulse roared in my ears. I slammed the book shut and shoved it back into the drawer, then leaned forward with my hands braced on the desk, breathing hard. "This is altitude sickness," I said louder now. "You've had it before. Visual disturbances. Anxiety." The words felt thin in the air. The sound deepened again, resolving into something like a vibration you feel more than hear. The stars on the monitor began to shift, not position, but brightness, tiny fluctuations rippling across the field. I forced myself to look. The stars were pulsing again, more of them this time, their light rising and falling in overlapping rhythms. Not synchronized, conversational, a pattern of response and reply. Something tightened in my chest, a cold certainty settling in. These weren't random changes. They were corrections. I reached for the power controls, intent on shutting down the observation systems entirely. If I wasn't watching, if I wasn't recording, the lights flickered. The main monitor went dark for half a second, then came back on. The power readouts remained steady, mocking me with their normalcy. The pulsing stopped all at once. Silence flooded the room, so complete it felt artificial. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I became acutely aware of the weight of the mountain above me, the miles of rock and sky pressing down, of how small the observatory was, how exposed. Slowly, reluctantly, I raised my eyes toward the slit. The sky had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way I could point to and explain. But the arrangement felt wrong now, like a familiar face seen at an angle that reveals something you can't unsee. The darkness between the stars seemed deeper, denser, as if it had substance. And in that darkness, something waited, patient and precise, as the rules continued to unfold. I stayed very still, counting my breaths until the shaking in my hands eased into something manageable. Panic makes you loud. Panic makes you careless. Whatever was happening up there felt exacting, procedural. I had the sense that mistakes would be noticed. I forced myself to sit back down. The silence didn't lift, pressed. Even the servers seemed muted, their usual hum dampened to a distant suggestion. I checked the ambient microphones again. Flat lines across the board. No wind, no movement. Outside, the stars held their positions, wrong but stable, like furniture rearranged while you were asleep. I opened the logbook again, slower this time. The drawer slid out without a sound. I half expected resistance, like the book didn't want to be read anymore. It lay where I'd left it, heavy and inert. No new writing had appeared. That strangely unsettled me more than if it had. I flipped back through earlier pages, reading properly now instead of skimming. Patterns emerged. Warnings clustered around certain dates, certain hours. Repeated mentions of specific constellations, all marked with the same subtle notation in the margins. A small dot, sometimes two. I found Martin's handwriting eventually, tighter than mine, nervous in places. If you notice the dark expanding, close the dome slit partially. Do not seal it completely. I looked up at the slit, wide open above me. Another entry followed, dated years earlier. Do not attempt to map the negative space. My throat tightened. I hadn't realized how often my eyes had been drawn to the gaps between stars, how my attention kept slipping there despite myself. I reached for the dome controls and adjusted the aperture, narrowing it just enough that the sky felt less exposed. The mechanism responded immediately, the metal panels gliding inward with a muted scrape. The pressure in the room eased. Not gone, but reduced, like loosening a grip that had been cutting off circulation. I exhaled shakily and leaned back in my chair. My heart was still racing, but my thoughts began to organize themselves again. Rules, protocols. This place had them for a reason. I should have read the book more carefully when I took over. On the main monitor, the stars remained steady. No pulsing, no dimming. The pattern held. I let myself hope, briefly, that I'd done the right thing. Then the temperature dropped. Not gradually. Not the slow, expected descent of night on the mountain. The digital thermometer on the wall ticked down 3 degrees in the span of seconds. Frost bloomed along the edges of the slit, feathering outward in delicate, fast-growing patterns. My breath fogged. I stood and pulled my jacket back on, fingers clumsy with cold. The air tasted sharper now, biting at the back of my throat. Somewhere deep in the structure, metal groaned under sudden contraction. I checked the external sensors again. No weather front, no wind shift. The mountain, according to every instrument, was unchanged. Another star dimmed, then another, not disappearing this time, just dimming, their light sinking lower, as if being turned down by an unseen hand. The surrounding stars adjusted again, compensating, maintaining an overall balance that made the change hard to perceive unless you were looking for it. I was looking for it. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Martin again, standing by the window at dawn, his reflection superimposed over the fading stars. "They don't like symmetry broken," he'd said. "They'll fix it. Always do." I'd asked him what he meant. He'd smiled, thin and tired. "You'll learn the rules." I swallowed and forced myself to look away from the monitor, fixing my gaze on the far wall instead. According to the book, if a star dimmed without atmospheric cause, I was supposed to avert focus for at least 60 seconds. I counted silently. My pulse thudded in my ears. The cold gnawed at my fingers. At 47, the sound returned. Stronger now. A deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It filled the space like pressure fills a seal chamber. My teeth chattered, not entirely from the cold. At 60, I looked back. The dimming had stopped. The stars held, their new brightness levels fixed in place. The pattern looked tighter somehow, more efficient, satisfied. A sharp crack echoed through the dome as ice split along a seam. I flinched despite myself. The radio crackled to life. I stared at it, heart leaping into my throat. The display glowed faintly, the channel indicator steady. No incoming signal icon, just open air. Then a sound came through. Not static, not a voice. A tone, low and sustained, like a note held too long. It vibrated through the speaker and into the room, resonating with the hum beneath the floor. My chest tightened painfully as the frequency seemed to settle into my bones. I slapped the power switch. The radio went dark. The tone continued. It wasn't coming from the speaker. It was coming from above. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't entering me. It was already inside, a shared resonance between my body and the space I occupied. On the monitor, the stars began to brighten. Not all of them, just a cluster near the edge of the field. They flared in sequence, one after another, tracing a shape I didn't recognize but felt compelled to follow. My eyes moved despite my efforts to keep them fixed elsewhere. The shape completed itself. The tone shifted, resolving into something like relief. The cluster dimmed back to baseline. The rest of the sky followed, settling into a new equilibrium. The cold eased. The ice stopped spreading. The sound faded, leaving behind the ordinary noises of the observatory, their sudden return almost jarring. I sagged against the console, breathing hard, sweat prickling cold against my skin. The logbook drawer slid open. I didn't touch it. I didn't have to. The book lay open to a blank page. Ink bled into the paper, forming words with careful precision. "Do not acknowledge successful correction." Below it, another line appeared, slower this time. "Gratitude implies agency." My hands curled into fists. A hysterical laugh bubbled up and died in my throat. "You're not," I started, then stopped. Speaking felt dangerous now, like interpretation. I shut my mouth and nodded once, a small, instinctive gesture of compliance. The writing stopped. I stayed where I was, afraid to move, afraid to think too loudly. Outside, the stars watched in their quiet, ordered way, their light reaching down through the slit and washing over the instruments that had learned, over decades, how not to offend them. The night wasn't over, and I was beginning to understand that surviving it wasn't about bravery, or intelligence, or even sanity. It was about following the rules precisely enough that the stars would let me remain where I was, uncorrected, until morning. I didn't move for a long time after that. I measured the passing minutes by the faint tick of the wall clock, each second landing too loudly in the renewed quiet. My body felt like it had been tuned to something I didn't fully understand yet, every nerve alert for a shift in pressure or light. Eventually, the cold drove me back into motion. I crossed the control room slowly, deliberately, careful not to rush or hesitate too much. Both felt wrong. The heater controls sat beneath a warning placard I'd read 100 times and never really seen. I reached out, then stopped. Another memory surfaced, unwelcome and sharp. Martin again, his hand hovering over the same switch. Heat changes air density, he'd said. Air changes refraction. I pulled my hand back. The temperature had stabilized, low but tolerable. I layered up instead, tugging on gloves and a scarf from my locker. The fabric smelled faintly of dust and old soap. Human smells. Grounding. I checked the monitors without staring too long at any one point. The sky feed showed stability across all fields. No dimming, no pulsing. The pattern held. I let myself sit again, carefully, and returned to the logbook. It remained open to the last entry, the ink fully dried now. I turned the page. The next one was blank. No warning appeared as I watched. Good. Or neutral, at least. I flipped back a few pages and found something I'd missed earlier. A section marked with a folded corner. Martin's handwriting again. If corrections escalate, reduce observation bandwidth. Never go dark entirely. My eyes flicked to the power controls. Shutting everything down had been my instinct earlier. According to the book, that would have been a mistake. I pulled up the observation settings and narrowed the feed further, reducing resolution, limiting the field to a thin arc of sky. Enough to fulfill the observatory's mandate. Not enough to invite scrutiny. The room seemed to relax. I felt it in my shoulders, a subtle easing of tension I hadn't realized was there. The clock crept past 1 a.m. Time felt strange now, stretched, elastic. The night didn't advance so much as it settled deeper around the building, layers of darkness stacking quietly outside the dome. A faint smell crept into the room. Not ozone this time, something drier, older, like stone exposed after centuries underground. I inhaled carefully, testing the air. No alarms triggered. No sensor registered contamination. The smell lingered anyway, threading through my breath. I checked the exterior cameras. The mountain slopes lay silent, silvered by starlight. No movement, no clouds. Then, on the edge of one frame, something shifted. Not an object, a distortion. The stars behind it bent subtly, their light warping around an unseen boundary. It lasted less than a second, then smoothed out. I looked away immediately, heart hammering. The rule about mapping negative space echoed in my head. I didn't know if what I'd seen counted, but I wasn't about to test the margin. The smell intensified, then faded, like a presence passing through the room without stopping. I swallowed and forced myself to focus on something solid. I made coffee, my hands shaking as I poured water into the machine. The gurgle and hiss were painfully loud in the quiet. Steam rose, briefly fogging the air before dissipating. The first sip burned my tongue. I welcomed the pain. When I set the mug down, I noticed my reflection in the darkened monitor. Pale, eyes too bright. Something about my expression struck me as unfamiliar, like I was already halfway to becoming one of those tight, nervous entries in the logbook. A soft click came from the drawer. I froze. The drawer slid open an inch, then stopped. The logbook inside remained closed this time. No pages turning. No writing appearing. I waited. Nothing else happened. Slowly, carefully, I nudged the drawer shut with my knee. It closed without resistance. The clock ticked on. At 2:30, the stars shifted again. Not brightness, not position, orientation. It took me a few seconds to understand what I was seeing. The constellations were the same, but the angles between them had changed, as if the sky had rotated around a different axis. The effect was subtle enough that the software didn't flag it. To the charts, everything was still where it should be. To my eyes, the sky had tilted. The pressure returned, heavier this time, pushing down on my chest. The vibration crept back into the room, low and pervasive, resonating through the chair and up my spine. I forced myself to breathe slowly, evenly. Observation without interpretation. That was the rule. On the monitor, the tilted stars held their new positions. No pulsing, no dimming, just waiting. Another line from the logbook surfaced in my mind, one I hadn't fully understood before. If orientation shifts, remain seated. Standing introduces unnecessary variables. I stayed where I was. Minutes passed, or hours. It was hard to tell. The vibration deepened, then softened, like a question asked and answered elsewhere. Gradually, the sky eased back into its familiar orientation, the stars sliding into place with quiet precision. The pressure lifted. I sagged forward, elbows on my knees, breathing hard. The logbook drawer opened fully. This time I looked. The book lay open, pages turning slowly, as if moved by a breeze that didn't exist. It stopped on a page near the middle, one I hadn't seen before. The entry was long, dense, written in a hand that wasn't Martin's or mine or anyone else I recognized. The letters were precise, angular, as if each stroke had been carefully negotiated. "You are adapting." Below it, another line appeared, almost hesitant. "Adaptation is acceptable. Curiosity is not." My mouth went dry. I felt a surge of something dangerously close to relief, to being noticed in a way that wasn't immediately fatal. I clenched my jaw and gave no sign of acknowledgement. No nod this time, no reaction at all. The page stilled. The drawer closed itself with a soft, final click. Outside, the stars held steady, their light cold and distant and exact. The mountain remained silent beneath them, and the observatory stood as it always had, a small, careful interface between human attention and something vast enough to require rules. I sat there through the long, thinning hours of night, learning, without words, without questions, how to remain precisely uninteresting until dawn. The hours after that blurred into a narrow tunnel of awareness. I stopped checking the clock. Time had become unreliable, a suggestion rather than a structure. Instead, I marked progress by sensation, the way the cold ebbed and returned, the subtle tightening and loosening of the pressure in the room, the stars holding, then adjusting, then holding again. I stayed seated. My legs ached. Pins and needles crept up from my feet, sharp enough to make my eyes water. I didn't shift my weight. I didn't stretch. Standing, the book had warned, introduced variables. So I endured. At some point, the vibration changed character. It wasn't deeper or louder. It became more focused, as if whatever produced it had narrowed its attention. The air in front of me felt denser, harder to see through, like heat distortion without the heat. I stared at the far wall and counted breaths. 1, 2, 3. The stars on the monitor flickered. Just once. Then a line appeared across the feed. Not a scratch. Not interference. A clean, deliberate absence of data, slicing horizontally through the star field. Above it, the stars remained. Below it, the same. The line itself contained nothing. My pulse spiked. I forced it down, pressing my tongue against the roof of my mouth until the metallic taste sharpened my focus. The logbook did not move. That somehow felt like permission. I reduced the observation bandwidth further, shrinking the active field until the line slipped just out of view. The moment it disappeared from the monitor, the pressure eased slightly, like a hand loosening around my throat. I exhaled slowly. The smell returned, stronger now, dry stone and something faintly organic, like old bone warmed by sun that never reached this altitude. It filled the room without triggering any alarms. My eyes stung. I tasted it at the back of my tongue. Something brushed the outside of the dome. Not a strike, not an impact. Contact, gentle, exploratory. The metal skin of the observatory responded with a low, resonant groan that vibrated through my chair. I clenched my fists in my lap and did not look up. The contact slid, slow and careful, tracing a curve along the dome's exterior. The vibration followed it, mapping the path with unsettling intimacy. I imagined dangerously I knew something enormous and precise, testing the boundary between inside and out. The vibration paused directly above me. The air thickened again, pressing down on my shoulders, my spine. My breath came shallow and fast despite my efforts to control it. I closed my eyes. Darkness bloomed behind my lids, but it wasn't empty. Points of light pricked through, sharp and insistent. Not stars. After images, or something else entirely. I opened my eyes. The monitor showed a new configuration. The stars in the reduced field had rearranged themselves into a tight cluster. Their relative positions altered just enough to form a shape that made my stomach drop. Not a constellation, a marker, a boundary drawn in light, a warning. The logbook drawer slid open a few inches. I didn't look. The vibration intensified, then stopped abruptly. The contact on the dome lifted. The smell faded, leaving behind the familiar, sterile scent of cold metal. Silence returned, brittle and tense. I risked a glance at the monitor. The cluster dissolved, the stars sliding back into a pattern that felt neutral, unremarkable. Approved. My body sagged with exhaustion. Sweat chilled on my skin. My jaw ached from clenching it so hard. The logbook drawer closed. I let myself breathe again, deeper this time, careful not to let the relief turn into gratitude. Gratitude implied agency. The words echoed in my head, steadying me. Somewhere outside, far beyond the reach of the dome, something vast had tested a boundary and found it intact. The clock on the wall ticked forward, indifferent. I stared at the thinning band of sky visible through the narrowed slit and waited, muscles screaming, thoughts held in check, learning the most important lesson the observatory had to teach. The stars didn't need worship. They needed restraint. Sometime after that, fatigue became a physical weight. Not just tiredness, but a dragging pull behind my eyes, a pressure that made it hard to keep my thoughts aligned. My body wanted shortcuts. It wanted movement, reaction, commentary. All of those felt dangerous now. I focused on stillness, on being a fixed point in the room, no more interesting than a chair or a rack of cables. The stars remained quiet, too quiet. The absence of change felt deliberate, like a held breath that could break at any moment. I noticed then that the shadows in the control room had shifted. The lighting hadn't changed. The monitors still glowed at their usual levels. But the shadows cast by the equipment seemed sharper, deeper, their edges unnaturally crisp. They didn't quite match the shapes that should have been casting them. I avoided looking too closely. Another smell crept in, faint this time. Cold dust. The inside of an unopened drawer. The sense of something sealed being gently disturbed. The vibration returned, shallow but persistent, like a low hum felt through the soles of my feet rather than heard. It wasn't coming from above anymore. It was coming from below. I swallowed hard and glanced at the floor. The concrete beneath my boots looked unchanged, smooth and pale in the artificial light. But the vibration resolved into a rhythm, uneven and exploratory, as if something were testing the density of the mountain itself. I remembered another line from the logbook, one I dismissed when I first read it months ago. If resonance travels upward, remain grounded. I pressed my boots flat against the floor and leaned forward slightly, hands resting on my knees, making deliberate contact with the room. The vibration softened, then spread out, diffusing until it became part of the background hum. Approved. A thin sheen of sweat coated my palms. I wiped them on my pants and forced myself to stay focused. Dawn was still hours away. The night wasn't done with me yet. The stars dimmed. Not one. Not a cluster. All of them. The sky on the monitor sank uniformly, as if someone were slowly lowering a dimmer switch. The effect was so smooth, so controlled, that my first instinct was to check the exposure settings. I stopped myself. Uniform change. Systemic adjustment. This wasn't something to correct. The room darkened with the sky. The stars didn't vanish. They retreated, becoming fainter, more distant, as if acknowledging a boundary I couldn't see. The pressure in the room lifted almost entirely. For the first time in hours, my chest felt light. I realized then that the attention I'd been feeling, the weight, the scrutiny, had shifted away from the observatory. Not gone. Redirected. Focused elsewhere. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, I felt a cautious relief. The logbook drawer did not open. Minutes passed. The stars held their dim state, steady and restrained. The vibration faded to nothing. Even the mountains seemed to relax, the deep, ancient creeks settling into silence. I risked a small movement, flexing my fingers. Nothing reacted. I took another breath, then another. The room remained neutral. Something inside me loosened, just a fraction, enough to let a thought slip through unguarded. The moment the word formed, the pressure slammed back into the room. Not crushing, constricting, like a warning hand closing around my ribs. The stars flared, just for an instant, a sharp, brilliant pulse that seared itself into my vision. The vibration roared back, focused and angry, rattling the equipment and setting my teeth on edge. I bit down hard, cutting the inside of my cheek. The taste of blood grounded me, shockingly vivid. No interpretation, no curiosity. The flare subsided. The stars dimmed again, returning to their restrained state. The pressure eased, but didn't vanish entirely. It lingered, a reminder pressed into the air. The logbook drawer slid open. I didn't look. I didn't need to. I could feel the expectation radiating from it, the demand for acknowledgement, for understanding. I gave it nothing. Seconds stretched. The pressure held. Then, slowly, the drawer closed. The message was clear enough. Observation was tolerated. Endurance was acceptable. Even adaptation had its place. But the moment I reached for meaning, for motive, for anything beyond what my senses reported, the rules tightened. I sat there, breathing carefully, letting the lesson sink into muscle and bone rather than thought. Outside, the stars remained dim and distant, their light reaching me only after passing through layers of restraint I was only beginning to comprehend. The night crept onward, thinner now, stretched toward a dawn that felt theoretical rather than inevitable. I didn't know what would happen when the stars brightened again. I only knew that, when they did, I needed to be exactly where I was, doing exactly nothing, thinking exactly enough to stay alive. The dimness held. That became the most unsettling part. Not the pressure, not the vibrations, not even the sense of being measured, but the way the stars stayed restrained longer than they ever should have. The sky had a rhythm I knew intimately. Brightening and fading followed patterns tied to altitude, humidity, the slow roll of the earth itself. This was none of that. The stars weren't obeying physics. They were waiting. I remained seated, posture rigid now more from habit than fear. My legs had gone numb. The pain came and went in distant pulses, like it belonged to someone else. I welcomed it. Pain anchored me in my body, reminded me I was still a participant in the physical world. The control room lights flickered once. Not a failure, not a surge, just a momentary dip, like a blink. The shadows on the walls shifted again. This time I couldn't ignore it. They didn't move in response to the lights. They adjusted independently, sliding a fraction of an inch across the concrete floor, aligning themselves at angles that made no sense given the fixed positions of their sources. The shadow of the main console elongated toward me, thin and reaching, then stopped. I stared at a bolt on the floor instead, memorizing its imperfections. Rust fleck, hairline crack in the concrete, a place where oil had soaked in years ago and never quite faded. Grounding, always grounding. The smell returned abruptly, stronger than before. Dry stone, cold dust, and something else beneath it now. Something faintly wet, mineral-rich, like water that had seeped through rock for centuries without ever seeing light. The air pressure dropped. My ears popped, sharp and painful. I winced, then froze, afraid the reaction itself might count as a variable. The pressure stabilized a moment later, leaving behind a dull ache behind my eyes. On the monitor, the dim stars began to move. Not drift, slide. The entire field shifted as one, gliding laterally across the screen without any corresponding motion in the telescope's position data. It was smooth, controlled, and utterly impossible. I did not follow it with my eyes. The rules had taught me enough to know that tracking movement like that invited escalation. Instead, I watched the edge of the monitor frame, letting the stars pass through my peripheral vision like weather. The movement slowed, then stopped. The stars held. Something new occupied the center of the field now. Not a star, not darkness, a density. The best way I can describe it is this. It was a place where light arrived and did not leave. Not absorbed, not bent, simply ended. a boundary defined by absence rather than shape. My throat tightened. Every instinct screamed at me to look directly at it, to understand what I was seeing. I stared at the bolt on the floor and counted breaths until the urge dulled. The vibration returned, low and focused, synchronized with my heartbeat in a way that made my skin crawl. Felt like a test, a calibration. The logbook drawer slid open. I didn't look, but I could hear the pages shifting this time. Slow, deliberate, each turn accompanied by a faint scrape, like paper being dragged across stone instead of wood. The vibration intensified. The pressure in the room increased, not downward this time, but inward, squeezing from all sides. My lungs protested. Each breath felt insufficient, shallow and thin. I lowered my gaze further, chin nearly to my chest, reducing my field of view to the smallest possible slice of the room. Less input, less reaction. The pressure held. Seconds stretched. Sweat trickled down my spine, icy against my skin. My jaw trembled with the effort of staying still. Then, slowly, the pressure eased. The vibration softened, fading back into the background hum. The pages stopped turning. The drawer closed. I risked a glance at the monitor. The density was gone. The stars had returned to their dim, restrained state, arranged in a configuration that felt intentionally bland. Unremarkable. Safe. I sagged back against the chair, a silent gasp tearing out of me before I could stop it. The room did not react. I stayed perfectly still until my breathing slowed again. That was when I realized something else had changed. The night outside the slit looked thinner. Not lighter, thinner. As if the darkness had been stretched, its depth reduced. The stars, dim as they were, felt farther away than before, like they'd retreated behind an extra layer of distance. I checked the time at last. Just past 4 a.m. Dawn was no longer theoretical. The thought brought a dangerous surge of hope with it, and I crushed it immediately. Hope was interpretation. Hope implied an ending. The stars did not care about endings. They cared about balance. I remained seated, eyes lowered, breathing steady, as the night continued its careful withdrawal, and whatever rules governed the sky decided, silently, impersonally, that I was still acceptable enough to leave uncorrected. The first hint of morning came without light, came as a loosening. The pressure that had wrapped itself around the observatory for hours began to thin, not vanish, just stretch, as if whatever had been holding its focus was slowly withdrawing its grip. The air felt easier to breathe. My chest expanded more fully with each inhale, and I hadn't realized how shallow my breaths had been until they deepened on their own. I stayed still. The rules hadn't said anything about dawn being safe. The stars remained dim, but their restraint felt different now. Less like a command, more like a conclusion. The vibration faded to something I could almost mistake for the building's normal resonance. The quiet dialogue between wind, stone, and aging steel. The shadows softened. They didn't snap back into place all at once. They bled into their proper shapes gradually, edges blurring, angles correcting themselves as the room returned to a geometry I recognized. I watched this happen only indirectly, tracking it through reflections on the polished surfaces of the equipment rather than looking straight at the walls. Cautious even now, the smell dissipated last. That dry, ancient scent thinned until it was just cold metal and dust again. Ordinary. Human. I flexed my fingers slowly. Pins and needles flared, sharp and painful, then settled. My legs followed, sensation returning in waves that made me grit my teeth. I didn't stand. Not yet. On the monitor, the stars began to brighten. Not flare. Not pulse. They returned. Light increased uniformly, smoothly, restoring depth and distance to the sky. The constellations slid back into familiar alignments, their angles correcting with a precision that felt final. Whatever balance had been negotiated through the night was being released. I kept my eyes on the center of the screen, careful not to track individual points. Observation without attachment. The sky accepted that. The logbook drawer remained closed. Minutes passed. Then more. The light outside the slit shifted subtly, the black of night easing toward a deep, diluted blue. The mountain began to wake in its own slow way. A faint sigh of wind, the distant crack of rock warming after a long freeze. The stars continued to fade, surrendering to the approaching day. Only then did I risk standing. My legs nearly buckled beneath me, a rush of blood and pain stealing my breath. I caught myself on the edge of the console and waited it out, head bowed, letting my body remember how gravity worked. Nothing reacted. I straightened slowly. The room felt neutral, not empty, not welcoming, simply uninterested. I crossed to the slit and adjusted it further closed, sealing the dome against the rising light. The mechanism responded without complaint. The metal panels met with a soft, final sound that felt like punctuation. When I turned back, the logbook drawer slid open. I stopped. This time I looked. The book lay open to the last page that had been written during the night. No new ink formed as I watched. The words already there seemed settled, finalized, endurance acknowledged. Below it, a final line appeared, slower than any before. Daylight resets tolerance. My hands trembled, but I kept them at my sides. No nod, no reaction. The ink dried. The drawer closed. I stood there for a long moment, absorbing the meaning without letting it turn into interpretation. The rules weren't gone. They were suspended, waiting for the next cycle. Outside, dawn broke over the mountain, pale and cold and entirely ordinary. Sunlight crept across the ridge, spilling down the slopes, touching the observatory with a warmth that felt almost intrusive after the long night. I powered down the observation systems in the approved sequence, careful to follow every step exactly as outlined in the manual. The screens went dark one by one, leaving behind the soft glow of standby lights. When everything was quiet, I allowed myself to sit again, exhaustion crashing over me now that it was finally permitted. I did not sleep. I waited for the sun to fully clear the horizon, for the sky to empty itself of stars completely, for the night to retreat far enough that it could no longer reach in and adjust anything else. Only then did I allow myself to believe, not hope, not assume, that I had made it through another cycle uncorrected. The observatory stood silent around me, its ancient instruments at rest, already preparing for the next night when the rules would matter again. By the time the sun was fully up, the mountain had returned to its daytime version of indifference. The sky was an empty blue bowl, scrubbed clean of everything that had watched me through the night. Birds traced small, careless arcs above the ridge. The wind found its voice again, rattling loose metal and carrying the faint scent of pine from lower elevations. Nothing about the morning suggested that rules had been enforced, boundaries tested, or corrections narrowly avoided. That, I learned, was part of it. I logged the night's activity in the official digital record using the most conservative language possible. Calibration completed. Minor temperature variance. No instrument faults. No anomalies requiring follow-up. The words felt dishonest, but not incorrect. The systems had functioned. The sky had remained observable. I was still present. The physical logbook stayed closed. I did not open it again before leaving. I locked the dome and stepped outside, blinking in the brightness. My shadow stretched long and familiar across the stone. Correct. Predictable. The mountain accepted it without comment. The drive down was uneventful. Too uneventful. Every switchback felt like a test I no longer knew how to fail. I kept my eyes on the road, resisting the urge to look back at the observatory perched above the treeline, its dome gleaming harmlessly in the sun. At the bottom of the access road, my phone regained signal. Messages flooded in. Weather updates, A reminder about an upcoming maintenance inspection. A brief email from the regional office confirming my next scheduled overnight rotation. I read it once, then again. 3 nights from now. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I sat there with the engine idling, listening to it hum, grounding myself in the sound of something mechanical and finite. The night had taught me restraint, not avoidance. The observatory didn't allow abandonment. It allowed compliance. Back home, sleep came in fragments. Short, shallow bursts filled with half-formed images of light adjusting itself just out of view. I woke often, checking the time, checking the ceiling, reminding myself where I was. Daylight remained neutral. By the second afternoon, the fatigue had settled into something manageable. My hands stopped shaking. My thoughts lined themselves up again. I found myself reviewing the night not emotionally, but procedurally, cataloging what had escalated and what had de-escalated, what had drawn attention and what had reduced it. Patterns emerged. The stars reacted to focus, to curiosity, to attempts at meaning. They tolerated measurement, presence, endurance. They corrected imbalance with precision, not malice. They did not want reverence. They wanted restraint. When I returned for my next shift, I arrived earlier than usual. I read the logbook from cover to cover before sunset, not skimming this time, not dismissing anything as superstition or metaphor. Every warning aligned. Every rule reinforced the same principle. Do less. Look carefully. Don't reach. The night unfolded more quietly than the last. There were no pulses, no dimming, no pressure that demanded my attention. The stars behaved themselves, holding steady in their approved configurations. The room remained neutral, uninterested. I followed every rule anyway. I stayed seated when orientation felt subtly off. I reduced bandwidth at the first hint of distortion. I averted my gaze when gaps felt too noticeable. I kept my thoughts narrow and procedural, my attention disciplined. The logbook remained still. Near dawn, the stars dimmed briefly, uniformly, then returned as daylight approached. No escalation, no correction. When the sun rose, I understood. The rules weren't punishments. They were filters. The observatory wasn't a place to discover what the stars were. It was a place to learn how much attention they allowed before deciding you were a problem that needed fixing. I continue to manage the facility. I file clean reports. I train new staff carefully, focusing on procedure, not wonder. I emphasize routine. I discourage improvisation. Most don't last long up here anyway. Those who do learn quickly. If you ever find yourself under a sky so dark it feels crowded, if the stars seem a little too orderly, a little too responsive, remember this. Observe, measure, endure, and never, under any circumstances, try to understand what's watching you back.